Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Sensitivity Analysis for Cost-Benefit Studies in Justice Policy, a primer. That's quite a mouthful. We're really glad you could join us today. We hope it will be an interesting and informative session for all of you. I'm Carl Matthies. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Vera Institute. I'm going to let this slide linger for just a few moments in case we have some folks who are just now dialing into the meeting. But we'll get started real quick. Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Once again, I'm Carl Matthies, a Senior Policy Analyst with the Vera Institute. Vera is a nonprofit, nonpartisan center dedicated to making justice systems more fair and effective through research and innovation. And I'm joined today by Ben Bryant. He's an economist with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, whose mission is to reduce poverty through economic growth. Ben conducts cost-benefit analysis in a variety of sectors, including agricultural investments, roads, and green energy, and he's done work in places such as Senegal and Indonesia. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you.
Okay, here's a look at our agenda. I'll explain a few things about how this webinar format works. Then I'll hand it over to Ben to say a few words about why sensitivity analysis is a vital component of cost-benefit analysis, or CBA for short. I'll take the reins back to discuss changing the perspective and deterministic sensitivity analysis before letting Ben deliver the finale, which is a demonstration of probabilistic sensitivity analysis in Excel. We'll wrap things up with a final Q&A session and some concluding remarks. But before we go any further, actually we'd like to conduct a couple of polls. The first of these is, how familiar are you with sensitivity analysis, in particular sensitivity analysis in the context of cost-benefit studies? So go ahead and answer the question. B. Very good. I see answers flowing in. Few people yet to respond. I'll give just a few more seconds. Okay, let's go and look at the results. And it looks like we have kind of an interesting spread here. A few of you know a lot about it. Some have heard of it, maybe had an experience or two involving sensitivity analysis in the cost-benefit realm. But looks like the majority of you are unfamiliar. And I think that's good because we're going to try and walk everybody through it, and hopefully those of you who are a little more familiar can ask really intelligent questions that will make the session even more of a rich experience for everyone. So moving on to the next poll, we'd like to take your pulse as to what sector of employment you work in. So go ahead and start submitting answers to this poll, please. Okay, responses are coming in. All right, I think I will go ahead and skip to the results again. And not surprisingly, quite a few people from criminal justice agencies. That's more or less what we would have expected. Also, I guess the largest share is from research and academia, possibly, I suppose, relating to criminal justice issues or programs. We have also, well, quite a few people that don't fit into any of our categories. Yeah, we understand it's not an exhaustive list. So perhaps you can fill in the text box at the end of this webinar where we ask for your feedback and let us know what sector you do work in. So let's move ahead. Okay, just an important housekeeping item. You have a chat feature that should be in the lower left-hand corner where you can ask a question by typing it in, and we can answer it when we take one of our mini breaks for question and answer. We do suggest that you view the webinar in full screen mode because we have some graphics and tables that you might be able to see a little better. So unfortunately, you'll have to switch out of full screen mode in order to type in a question because the chat window disappears in the full screen mode. You can also use the chat feature if you're having some technical difficulties, or you can call 1-800-843-9166 or email help@readytalk.com. Another point to make is that we're recording this webinar, and that is for the benefit of those who cannot attend, and also for your future reference, and it will be available at cbkb.org. Okay, what we're hoping to pass along to you today is an appreciation for the importance of conducting sensitivity analysis as part of doing cost-benefit analysis studies. To demonstrate some of the techniques of sensitivity analysis, to get you started if you're a fledgling cost-benefit analysis, maybe even teach you a thing or two if you've done it for a while, and to help you interpret cost-benefit analysis results, whether you're a producer or a consumer of this kind of research. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Ben Bryant. Take it away, Ben.
All right, Carl, I did see that Jules has a question.
Okay. Is this a chat question? Okay, she says no thanks, so we can go ahead.
Sorry about that. All right, thank you everyone. Just to make a slight caveat in advance, I'm recovering from a little cold, so pardon if I'm a little sniffly or have to cough here and there. So as Carl just mentioned, we will be talking about sensitivity analysis in the context of cost-benefit analysis. And sensitivity analysis itself is a general technique that can be applied to all sorts of modeling. But cost-benefit analysis raises some particular issues. And so we want to first kind of make sure everyone's on the same page about the nature of cost-benefit analysis and also motivate how it sets up the need for diligence in doing sensitivity analysis. So that's what this section is about. So just as a quick review, I won't step through every single one of these points, and most of our slides are not this busy. But just for those of you who may not have been involved in CBA at all or in a while, these are the one version of the many steps that are involved. And what I'd like to just draw your attention to are some of the bullets in the middle where, so first the second one, there's some subjectivity involved in deciding whose benefits and costs count. And then there's also expertise involved in the third and fourth bullets, which I'm highlighting these points more on the next slide, that you need significant topical knowledge for the early parts of CBA to develop these models and predict these impacts. But then also there are political and subjective evaluation issues that arise. So as I mentioned, on whose benefits count, and then also on monetizing the impacts. So everyone may agree on what the impacts are, but different people may have different views about how those should have dollar values placed on them. And then finally, there's the latter part of cost-benefit analysis is relatively straightforward calculations where mainly if we've agreed on how we think the world works and we agree on the policy impacts and how we value them, we just need to, in essence, quote, run the numbers and then see what comes out. But given that everything we're doing in the early part generally relies on making a lot of assumptions and value judgments, it's very important to see whether the decisions or recommendations we might have about choosing a project would be affected by any of the assumptions that we made. And this is in general true for all modeling, but is an issue in cost-benefit analysis because it's very decision-oriented and also because of the subjective issues involved. And a last point to make just for everyone to keep in mind is that we can always consider the status quo as one of the choices to make. So usually when we're doing cost-benefit analysis, we're comparing things to what would happen otherwise. All right, and just to highlight some parts of CBA a little more, one of the benefits of cost-benefit analysis is that even without sensitivity analysis or other steps, the process of going through a cost-benefit analysis helps promote transparency in policymaking and helps people think through the issues that they are trying to confront and the actual mechanisms by which they will be confronted. So you're forcing all the stakeholders to be transparent about what is getting valued and what's not, and also how they think different programs or policies might actually work. Another advantage is that when everything is successfully put into dollar terms, then if people agree on the methods by which that was done, that can allow for more efficient allocation of resources because we can help to direct our money to those projects that are going to produce the most benefits without having to worry about trade-offs that are difficult to monetize. But of course, that doesn't always happen. So one of the weaknesses is the subjectivity involved in putting things into common terms, especially since people may disagree about how to value certain outcomes. And also, as Carl will be discussing, the issue of who counts and what benefit streams count at all, let alone how much value to put on them, is another issue. So we'll be discussing that later. And then as a final setup, just to kind of illustrate the way that complications can arise and the need for sensitivity analysis can arise, just go to a model that was developed by Bo Kilmer at the RAND Corporation. They began studying this after California started considering whether to legalize marijuana and tax it pretty much the same way that we do cigarettes. And it's a relatively simple decision and a relatively straightforward set of outcomes that we care about. So there's the decision about whether to remove penalties for sale and possession, and then if you do that, also what kinds of tax rates to make and how to regulate it. And then the two main things we care about are what happens to marijuana consumption and the outcomes associated with that, and then also the state and local budget impact. And so, conceptually there is a big arrow going from the left to the right. But really, as you'll see on the next slide, which you don't need to decipher greatly, when you actually get into the details of modeling, each of these arrows represents a relationship that we need to be thinking about how to represent quantitatively. And again, you don't need to spend time delving into this, but the main point is just that it's complicated and that each of those steps is probably going to involve some degree of uncertainty or judgment calls. And so those are the sorts of things that we want to make sure we explore when we are doing our sensitivity analysis. Both if we are doing it to make our own decision, we want to know for ourselves what's best, but also if we're defending a particular decision or recommending a particular decision, we want to know if an opponent has said, well, did you consider these benefits or did you consider what happens if you're wrong about this? And you can say, yes, our choice is robust to that uncertainty, for example. And lastly, before moving on, just wanted to set up mainly the rest of the presentation by pointing out that, in my view, one of the things I try to drive home is that the way that we do uncertainty analysis is related to how we are able to characterize the uncertainty that we face. So sometimes we may have very little data to try to characterize the uncertainty that we have, so we just have some best guesses. They might be expert opinions or something else. Maybe there's been a few studies or something, so we can try to get plausible bounds from the economics literature or physical principles. Maybe everything that we're interested in has been very well studied and we actually have probability distributions for all of the parts of our model that we care about. And then lastly, for some things, it's really just an issue of preferences and concerns. And so for those, we might need to do different types of sensitivity analysis. And so we're actually going to be stepping through most of these, the first two in the deterministic part of the discussion. And I will be talking about Monte Carlo analysis, and then also Carl is about to talk about considering scope and different changes of perspective and scope as an aspect of doing scenarios. And one final point on all this is just to say that while your method of uncertainty analysis is informed by the way that you are able to characterize the uncertainty, it's by no means mutually exclusive, what I've described here. So that if you have well-characterized data, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do deterministic sensitivity analysis or consider scenarios or things like that. So.
Okay, thanks, Ben. That brings us to the first question and answer segment. So I don't see any questions queued up, but if somebody has a question that they want to type in really quickly, go ahead and do that right now. Okay, I don't think we have any questions. So I'm going to move on and talk about perspectives included in a CBA. The net benefits of a project or program or other investment can be highly dependent upon the perspective of the cost-benefit analysis. In other words, as Ben was saying, on who's given economic standing in the cost-benefit analysis. So recall this is that early step in the process which does have an element of subjectivity to it. So we want to bear in mind that the results can change dramatically when different perspectives are included. So here's what I'm talking about. This is a chart reproduced from a paper by McAllister, French, and Fang back in 2004. It shows the estimated tangible cost per offense for several types of felonies and across 3 different perspectives: that of crime victims, the criminal justice system, that is police, courts, corrections, and that of the offenders themselves. For victims, we're talking about medical expenses, lost wages, property loss or property damage. With regard to offenders, the way they calculated it in this study was foregone income, assuming minimum wage rate while they're incarcerated. And so when we're talking about including perspectives in a cost-benefit analysis, there'd probably be unanimous agreement that criminal justice system costs should be included if you're doing a CBA of a crime prevention program. And most would probably also agree that tangible victim costs should be counted. But you could probably start a pretty lively debate by including crime career costs. So that's, that just goes to show the subjectivity that can enter into it. I'm going to skip that. Okay, moving on. It's actually not the end of the story. There's also a distinction between tangible and intangible victim costs. Intangible costs include pain and suffering, psychological distress, depression, and for crimes like homicide or sexual assault, these costs can be enormous, staggering. So this study estimated the intangible victim costs, and how it did it was looking at past jury awards for wrongful death cases or grievous injuries. And normally those jury awards do distinguish between tangible and intangible costs. There's a separate award for pain and suffering. Okay, so here are a couple of hypothetical projects, both of which cost about $300,000 a year, let's say, and assume there's only money in the budget to do one of them. So Project A is thought to prevent perhaps 100 car thefts a year, and maybe it just consists of overtime for extra patrol in areas that have had a lot of car theft. Whereas Project B is a community outreach program. It's a little more intensive, something like counseling college students about the crime of date rape. if you compare these projects from the perspective of the criminal justice system alone, Project A might be seen as the better option to invest in, again, assuming the budget only allows for one or the other. However, if you incorporate both intangible and tangible victim costs, Project B turns out to yield more than twice the annual net benefits of Project A. Okay, so that was a short segment, but it may have raised a question or two, so I want to give people an opportunity to use the chat feature again to ask any questions. Okay, not getting any, so I'm going to move on to the next section, deterministic sensitivity analysis. What we're going to cover is probably the three most common types of deterministic sensitivity analysis, and these are partial sensitivity analysis, where you change one input at a time to see how it impacts the net present value of a program when the other variables are held constant. Extreme scenario analysis, which shows how good or bad the outcome could be. And break-even analysis, which solves for the input value at which the project is cost neutral. In all of these cases, we're deliberately choosing input values within the range of possible values for the inputs to answer specific questions about how the outcome responds. And that's why these sensitivity analyses are collectively known as deterministic. And this is in contrast to using random sampling to build a picture of an output distribution, which is what Ben is going to discuss later. Okay, first let's talk for a minute about the base case scenario. The base case scenario is a preliminary result. It's based on plausible or best estimate assumptions about the value of inputs into the cost-benefit model. And so it's typically the result on which one conducts a sensitivity analysis. So it's important to bear in mind here that there is an argument against at least reporting out the base case cost-benefit analysis results. And that is because it can be construed by policymakers as the most likely result. It could be the figure that they hang their hat on and quote to news sources, even if it's not an especially likely outcome. So the problem is that we might not have all that much confidence in our best estimates. In other words, our best estimates might not be very good. Okay. It's time to introduce the model that we'll be working with for the remainder of the session. This is a fictional or toy model, and Ben and I made this for illustrative purposes, though it is based on actual programs in existence. So let's say a jail is looking to find ways to save money by reducing the amount of time that low-level offenders are incarcerated, and they conceive of a jail work-release program that allows inmates convicted of a relatively minor offense to get 3 days taken off of their sentence for every 2 days that they work off-site from the jail facility. The daily marginal cost of the work-release program turns out to be a little higher than that for incarceration, but on the upside, those who comply with the program have their initial sentence reduced by 60% and can also be potentially less disposed to future offending that could land them back in jail. Our model makes several simplifying assumptions. First, the time horizon is 6 years, beginning at year 0. There are no recidivism costs or savings accruing until the following year. The program is not open to recidivists, and if you enter the program and fail to comply, you have to serve out your entire sentence, not just the remaining portion. There's no partial credit, in other words. Lastly, we assume that only those who successfully complete the program are going to experience any kind of effect from it in terms of a change in their recidivating. Okay, so here's how the costs and benefits are calculated relative to the status quo, where everyone just does their full jail time. Markup tool. So we have correction staff that add to the cost of this new program, and then we have they're in charge of supervising some number of eligible participants, some fraction P of whom participate in the program, and some fraction Q of whom actually comply with the program. F down here is the average point at which non-compliers fail out of the program, and they do their full initial sentence after that. Compliers have theirs, recall, reduced by 60%, and they also experience some average program effect E that changes their likelihood of recidivism relative to some baseline 5-year recidivism rate. And then over here you see the various Greek symbols that indicate that we are using a discount rate and summing these costs and benefits over the 6-year lifespan that we're considering. Okay, so this is a look at the base case. And for now, let's suffice to say that these estimates are educated guesses informed by things like, as Ben was saying, review of jail records or consultation of research literature. And according to our base case, the program has a net present value of $6.5 million over the 6-year time horizon that we're considering. Now the question is, what happens if specific model inputs end up deviating from these base case values? Okay, so with partial sensitivity analysis, the results are commonly visualized using a tornado chart, which depicts the impacts that the variation in each model input has on the net present value when the other inputs are held constant. So those at the top have the greatest influence, those at the bottom have the least influence, and that's what gives this its funnel shape. This is a naive partial sensitivity analysis in the sense that we don't have any bounds on the base case estimates. So we're just seeing what happens when each of the inputs is changed by plus or minus 20%. So this is that first way that Ben described of characterizing uncertainty, where you're just changing each of the base case inputs by a set percent. And you can see that when the program compliance rate up at the top is changed by plus or minus 20%, it translates to a plus or minus $10 million change in the net present value. And conversely, down at the bottom, the salaries of the correction staff can change by that 20% in either direction without really having much effect on the net present value. Okay, now we have a base case estimate along with some lower and upper bounds, and we could have derived these bounds from educated guesses. They could also be mathematical limits. So for something like the baseline recidivism rate, you can't have a recidivism rate over 100%. They could also be the product of further research into jail records or consultation with other similar jails, things of that nature. Now here's what the tornado chart looks like when the base case estimates are bounded. Notice that now, up at the top, it's variation in the program's effect on recidivism that has the largest impact on the net present value. And this is partly because our bounds in the program effect estimate are actually much larger than plus or minus 20%, while our bounds on some of the other estimates are much less than plus or minus 20%. Okay, moving on to the best and worst case scenarios. Perhaps the most important thing to notice on this slide is that the value for some of these inputs is the same for the best and the worst case. And if you had just plugged in the extreme values based on which way they move the partial sensitivity analysis on the tornado chart, you would actually arrive at the wrong answer for the worst case. And the reason for that is that our cost-benefit model in this case has nonlinear functional form. It's actually a parabola, sort of U-shaped, with some of the values affecting the magnitude and others having more of an effect on the sign. So the trough ends up being somewhere between the upper and lower values, upper and lower bounds, I should say, of the inputs. So even if we don't know the likelihood of these best and worst case scenarios coming to pass, these can still be useful. it might be a cause for concern, for example, if the best case scenario isn't much better than the base case, or it'd be even more disconcerting if the worst case scenario were horrific. And actually, I think that's where the real utility of extreme scenario analysis is. It gives decision makers some sense of the extent of risk involved in a program. You can see both negative net present value of 43.3 million and a positive 104.0 million. Those are pretty extreme values. And really, we do want to try and attach some probabilistic estimates to those if we can. Lastly, break-even analysis finds the variable values at which programs are cost neutral. This method is ideal for situations in which you're pretty confident in the best estimates for a lot of the parameters, but you want to understand how widely the more uncertain inputs can vary before the NPV, the net present value that is, becomes negative. It could be that the program's not like anything that's ever been introduced before, and so the daily cost of implementing it and the effect of the program are deep unknowns. And so here we see that the marginal cost of the program could go as high as $91 a day, and it would still be a break-even proposition. And then here's a look at the change in recidivism, the effect of the program, and we see that it's still a cost-neutral program, even if it has no effect of any kind on the baseline recidivism rate. That's useful in that it shows that it would make economic sense to implement this work release program regardless of whether it had any beneficial effect on participants' propensity to reoffend. The big caveat there is that recidivism is kind of a noisy or tricky outcome, and if you had, for example, a program that made no change in the recidivism rate, but offenders were graduating to more serious offenses, that would obviously change your perspective on whether or not this turned out to be a good idea. So that's a warning against having too simplistic a notion of what a good outcome is. Okay, I see there is one question, and it comes from Peg Flick. She asked, do you typically do this by hand, or are there tools to automate it? There are indeed tools to automate it, and that turns out to be an excellent segue into Ben's final session on probabilistic sensitivity analysis. Are there any other questions before I hand it over to Ben? It looks like no, so take it away, Ben.
Okay, thank you. All right, next slide. So one way of viewing deterministic sensitivity analysis as helping you explore drivers of the model, things that are important. But it doesn't actually do very much to tell you about what sort of outcomes you're actually likely to see. In particular, because you aren't changing, you aren't changing all the model inputs at once. In reality, it's not the case that we can just assume that all of our inputs will stay at whatever we thought the best guess was, and then conveniently only one of them will deviate from that. And especially in models where there are interaction effects, you really need to look at what happens when multiple variables are changing all at once. And we saw a little bit of that in the best and worst case slides. But for most of the other methods, they are, by definition, partial, and so we're just looking at what happens with a single variable. In addition to looking at moving multiple inputs at once, we also want to see how actual mathematical description of the uncertainty in our inputs translates into mathematical uncertainty in the output itself, because that's what we ultimately care about. If there's high uncertainty about what some assumptions we're making but they don't actually affect our outcome, then they're essentially irrelevant to our decision. So that's what we'll be demonstrating here, is how we can actually get pictures of this likelihood. And just an etymological side note, Monte Carlo, some of you may know, the term comes from in Monaco, where there's some handy casinos, and in general, that term got adopted into the modeling and simulation community to refer to any process where we're engaging in random draws of model features to assess the actual outcome. All right, so I am now going to share my desktop, which should have a running copy of Microsoft Excel, and one particular Monte Carlo program and sensitivity analysis add-in called Crystal Ball. There are quite a few different computer suites for conducting Monte Carlo analysis. Crystal Ball is one of them. At Risk is another. Model Risk is another. So if we don't have any particular recommendation on them. They all have various strengths and weaknesses. But Crystal Ball is pretty transparent, so that's what we're using here. And so this spreadsheet, which I hope everyone can see, is the actual Excel implementation of the model that was shown on the slides earlier. And you can see over here on the left, we have all of the input variables labeled. And then their baseline values appear in these green cells. And these green cells then are the actual input cells. And then this cell represents the output, which is the net present value of the program. Just so people can see, we won't focus in great detail on the model, but to show you a little bit under the hood, getting it back to the transparency issue that we talked about, we have the different sorts of benefit streams and cost streams coming from the model behavior. And these include the formulas that were shown on the previous slides before. And then we're discounting those. We first add them up undiscounted and then apply the standard discounting formulas for the time value of money. And then that gets us our net present value. So if you have seen Excel before, you know that these little red arrows are indicating that there's a bunch of comments in all of these cells. And one thing that Crystal Ball conveniently does is it tells us what distribution we decided to assume for each of these cells. So here it's a uniform distribution. This is a normal distribution. And if we look closer, we can actually see the parameters. I'll try to find an interesting one. I think maybe the sentence range here has a little more interesting nature to it. So when we talk about distributions, what do we actually mean? We're just talking about the probability that the outcome or the input will fall within certain ranges. And so those are described by distributions like this. And if we have data, we can specify the exact parameters of the distribution. And so here we have the mean at 180, but maybe we just read another study and realized that needs to go up, and so that'll shift things to the right. Or maybe we just learned that it doesn't need to go up, but it's much more skewed. So that'll make it more skewed. In general, these distributions can emerge from data and other studies that you have where other studies found certain distributions, or if you have historical data, you can fit the distribution yourself using a variety of tools. All right, so I'm going to leave that distribution alone, but hopefully people see. So that's log normal, just to illustrate a few other ones. This is also log normal, sorry. Normal and triangular. Triangular distribution is a common distribution for when we don't really have a very good idea. We might know some bounds to use, but you can see it's very much wider than a typical normal distribution, and it's kind of like a nice kind of default conservative distribution to consider. And you can adjust for any of these. You can decide that maybe you actually want to use a different distribution. And generally, Monte Carlo add-ins or other programs will just let you pick and or fit them. And you can see you have continuous distributions and also discrete distributions there. All right, so that's where these distributions are coming from and how they're defined. And then rather now in partial sensitivity analysis, what we'd be doing is changing a number here, changing a number here, and seeing what happened to the outcome. With Monte Carlo, what we're doing is we're stepping through, and in every single step, Excel is doing a random draw from those distributions that we just showed you. So if I say step here, you can see all these numbers just changed, and we got a much higher NPV. And I can do that again, and now this is actually the red in the parentheses, meaning that it's a negative NPV. So just from these few steps, we can see that there is a pretty big variation in the range of outcomes that we can expect. So already we're getting some valuable information there. And of course, though, we don't really want to just press a button for every single time that we want to update the simulation. So we can specify how many runs we want to do, either manually or ask for it to find a smooth distribution. And so here we'll just set 10,000 and say start. And now so it just ran 10,000 different simulations. And this is the outcome that emerged for the basic work release program and its benefits for the jail. And what you can see here is, so this value here is 0. So we have a bit of a right tail where it can get pretty high. Most of the time it doesn't get much lower than 6 million. Most of the time it doesn't get much higher above 18 million. You'll notice also that these limits, it's suppressing a few trials because just for a handy display, you saw that the actual best and worst case could reach as far out as around minus 40 million and plus 100 million, although the likelihood of that happening is incredibly small, so we would need to be doing millions of simulations before we would even get close to those points. And now one piece of information that is useful from a decision-making standpoint is you want to know, is the net present value of your investment going to be positive? And obviously that, in this context, is actually a probability question. So in Crystal Ball and in some other programs, you can actually just slide these bars, which will tell you the fraction of cases that are above a certain value. So you can see here in this certainty box, it's showing that I've set this right to around 0, and it's showing that 76% of the cases are above 0. So if we actually believe that our inputs and the input distributions were chosen well, then that means we can say that there's a 76% chance of this program having a positive net present value. Whether that is a sufficient chance for to undertake the program is a preference issue and a decision-making issue for the board or whoever, voters perhaps, because that's all the probability analysis can tell us is it can tell us the certainty, but it can't tell us whether that's sufficient for our own concerns. One nice thing is you do see that there is a lot more upside potential than there is downside risk. You can also look at the statistics for the distribution. So it's telling you the base case values, the mean and median, and any other statistics you might care about if you want to get very mathy. And you can also look at other types of sensitivity charts. This is similar in format to the tornado diagram, although it's actually looking at how much variation is really explained by the output once we incorporate these probabilities. So it's showing you that the initial sentence range for, I think, recidivists is very important, as is the program compliance rate. And most of these other outcomes are actually quite negligible. So that is some valuable information because it can direct us to saying, oh, we better go try to get more data about this in order to have a better idea of how well our program will work. All right, so that's in a quick overview of the basics of Monte Carlo. There are a lot more things that you can do with this program, both using Monte Carlo analysis and using other deterministic tools like to generate the tornado diagrams that were shown on the previous slides. But for that, I will call that finished, and if people have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, do we have any questions? Oh, here's a question. How do you validate the model to ensure that the relationships between each variable are accurately reflected and test your assumptions before you run the analysis? Ben, do you want to handle that one?
So I mean, that's, in general, all modeling ideally has both a verification validation component where the verification is making sure that your computational model actually does what your mathematical model says that it should be doing. And then the validation is about ensuring that the model is a good model to begin with. And I guess there's a couple answers to that. One is, it is definitely part art, not all science, but and part of this depends on whether you're trying to do ex ante or ex post cost-benefit analysis, so looking at something ahead of the time or trying to do a statistical estimation afterwards. In general, for forward-looking cost-benefit analysis, you really do have to rely on what data exists that you're able to get. And part of the point of the sensitivity analysis is that where you are not confident in that data, so that is where you did not validate those things very well, you should be more thorough in in exploring the sensitivity there. And so I in particular am a big fan of bounding so that you don't overrepresent your confidence, so that rather than saying, oh, well, we just assume it's this nice, tightly specified normal distribution, consider what happens if it's also uniform, for example. So I guess part of the answer is that that's sort of what sensitivity analysis is used for. And otherwise you just have to be looking at data and other relationships. You can, if you have other data sets to validate on, you can set your model using parameters from other data where you have the actual outcome and see how close it falls. And that's a whole area of model calibration, which is something separate.
Okay, well, I don't see, follow up on that question. Are more assumptions used to estimate intangible costs versus tangible costs? And I would say it's not so much a matter of the assumptions that are used, the number of assumptions that are used. It's sort of the strength of those assumptions. So we were talking earlier about the intangible costs estimates for crime victims, and they were really massive for things like sexual assault and for homicide, and some people have a hard time getting their head around those because they're sort of thinking, well, I mean, not to make value judgments, but are all of these people's pain and suffering really worth this much money? And is a jury verdict really the best way to estimate this? And in fact, there are other methods that are used to estimate things like that, and they all have their advocates and their detractors. There's also contingent valuation, which is simply putting the question to people on the street: how much would you pay to have the likelihood of being a crime victim reduced by such and such a percent, and extrapolated out to something like the value of a statistical life. Let's say the crime is murder. then you can come up with an estimate that way. But plenty of people think that, okay, well, with contingent valuation, somebody's just going to say a huge amount because they're not actually being asked to pay it. So that's one of the issues that arises with that. So I would say it's not so much a question of how many assumptions are involved. It's the strength of those assumptions and maybe the controversy of the methods that are used in deriving those estimates.
Yeah.
I hope that partially answered the question. Did you want to add something, Ben?
Yeah, just a quick one-sentence thing that, ultimately you're doing modeling and cost-benefit analysis for a purpose, and kind of the ultimate question is, do you feel that the model is adequately capturing the concerns and beliefs of all the stakeholders while being faithful to real-world relationships? And so I think there's not really, it's maybe harder to resolve disputes about intangible costs, but as far as the number of assumptions or their magnitude, there's definitely no a priori kind of assumption there. Sorry, not assumption, but lesson.
Okay. Any more questions? I'll let it go for just a few more seconds. Okay. Well, looks like it's time to wrap it up. So just to review, this is what we covered. We hope we did a reasonably thorough job of it. Certainly this was not an exhaustive presentation on the topic, but hopefully it did, as it was intended, give you some kind of a primer. The takeaway points, well, the one we really want to hammer is that the base case CBA is just a starting point. Don't treat it as the most probable outcome and forego sensitivity analysis. That is a dangerous tack to take. Also, more complicated sensitivity analysis, such as Monte Carlo, doesn't necessarily mean better, particularly if you don't have very good data. Okay, so there's nothing about sensitivity analysis that gets around data requirements of this kind of research. Monte Carlo with false confidence in the distributions could be worse than doing some well thought out deterministic sensitivity analysis. And that brings me to the third and fourth points, which is that these add-ons, these programs that you can run in Excel, they make the computation and the simulation deceptively easy. So you saw where Ben was able to rattle off 10,000 simulations practically in the blink of an eye and come up with this frequency distribution. But the hard part is actually figuring out what those ranges and probability distributions actually are. Okay, just a couple of reminders. Please do complete the evaluation before you leave the webinar. We really, really value your feedback, so please help us out with that. If you're interested in receiving more information and notifications, I see that the chairperson has made some notifications on it, but do visit the Cost Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice at cbkb.org, or follow us on Twitter at /CBKBank. You can also, if you have questions offline, you can contact either me or Ben Bryant. This is our contact information. There's also a general email at cbkb@cbkb.org. Just a word about the sponsor. The Cost Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice is a project of the Vera Institute of Justice and is funded by the U.S. Department of Justice's Bureau of Justice Assistance. And that's the grant number, along with a little disclaimer about the content. And last of all, I would like to extend a very heartfelt thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bryant for his help on today's webinar. And I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us and participating today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and so long. Bye-bye.